All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen, wa salatu wa salam ala sayyidil anbiya al-mursaleen, nabiyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in, amma ba'd. So this is where we left off last week. We started talking about the degrees of illumination. And we said, and we had spoken about, when Ghazāli talks about illumination and when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about nur, what is he essentially talking about? What is it that he's discussing?
Knowledge.
He's talking about, okay, knowledge, good, but knowledge is a bit abstract. Knowledge of what exactly?
This world and the hereafter.
Okay, so here let's put that into perspective a little bit. If I do adhkar, if I do my daily adhkar, I do my daily wird, my liturgy, and I keep repeating certain adhkar, then I'll be inspired to the life of the hereafter. When we talk about nur, when we talk about illumination, what is it actually that we're discussing and that we're talking about?
It's like a level of Iman.
Okay, yeah, we're talking about Iman, right? And we said Iman has to do a lot with certainty, that an individual's certainty in the belief in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it increases with his Iman. There's a direct correlation there. So the correlation between certainty and Iman, or Iman and Yaqeen, is something that is very fundamental, is something that's really important to keep in mind. So ma'rifah, it's the same thing, ma'rifatillah, knowing Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. By knowing Allah, I'm increasing in my certainty in his existence, right? And that is essentially what Iman is. And this is why you'll find a lot of, when we talk about tasawwuf and Sufism, why is it that so much of the discussion revolves around Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Why is it that we spend so much time talking about him, remembering him? Even the different types of adhkar, which we will get into inshallah, we'll talk about why is it that why is it so important, even the repetition of just the names for many of the practitioners of Sufism. And I think these things are very important questions that we will come to answer and we will come to discuss inshallah. So he talks about the degrees of illumination. And he says that these are basically three levels, right? He talks about the layman, he talks about the scholars, and he talks about the arifin or the muqarrabin, siddiqin, and he says that this is the highest level. And these are stages that an individual can move through, and even within these stages, Ghazāli mentions that there are degrees. So even amongst the laymen, you have degrees. There's a spectrum of them. Even amongst the scholars, you have a spectrum, and even amongst the arifin or the muqarrabin, these individuals also have layers and degrees to them. The highest of them, obviously, being the anbiya, the prophets and the messengers, alayhim assalam. So he mentions some examples for these degrees. So for the layman, he gives the example of a friend. So where basically you have a structure here and you have a house, right? So in that house, you have a friend that comes by and tells him, hey, Zayd is at home. And he's saying that this is the example of the layman. And even this, if you think about that, that's levels. It depends on the friend that's coming and giving that information. How much of your own certainty do you have? How much doubt do you have in yourself or in the information that's coming to you? The next layer would be that you're actually closer to this house now, and you can hear Zayd speaking from behind the wall. Now, is there a chance that it could be someone else or somebody who sounds like Zayd? Yeah, absolutely. And again, that shows us the degrees that are within that spectrum. So I find this example that Ghazāli gives is actually really, really good. And the third one, the arifin, is that you actually see Zayd. So not only have confirmation that you've been able to hear him now, your friend told you he was there. You have a third level of confirmation is where you actually see Zayd. Now, is it possible that there's somebody that looks like Zayd or that you could mistake? How is he facing you? Even that has degrees. So like I said, I think these are really great examples that Ghazāli gives and really gives us an understanding of how an individual reaches that level of yaqeen, how that individual reaches this level of absolute certainty. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith of Jibreel, he actually closes off the hadith he closes off the level of ihsan by saying to worship Allah as if you see him, right? And this is the metaphor that he sallallahu alaihi wasallam actually brings, and this is something that Ghazāli parallels with this idea of this individual or Zayd. So next chapter 7, this was the end of chapter 6. Are there any questions on this, on the example of the degrees and certainty and illumination? If not, okay, khalas, then I guess we can continue inshallah. So moving on to the next chapter, which is chapter 7, he starts breaking down knowledge, right? So he goes into knowledge a little bit further. When he talks about knowledge of the heart, and we had talked about how the heart is the mirror and how it is the receptacle of knowledge. And Ghazali now he's starting to elaborate a little bit more. He's set basically the groundwork now on helping us understand the heart and helping us understand, the what it is that we deal with on the outside, and how those things reflect and how they kind of interact with each other. Getting into the next chapter, he gets into a little bit deeper, and he explains this a little bit more. But in general, there are two types of knowledge. There's intellectual knowledge and there's religious knowledge, right? And I'll give you examples of this, inshallah. There's intuitive, and then there is acquired. Intuitive, he himself even admits, he says, I don't really know where this knowledge comes from. I don't know where this information comes from. It's just something that we are all born with. It's something that we all know. And then he talks about acquired knowledge, and he talks about in a worldly sense and in an otherworldly sense, meaning like, talking about the akhirah and talking about, these other things. And he gives examples of medicine, astronomy, geometry, medicine, etc. The different physical sciences, and he talks about those and how these different types of knowledge are actually acquired. And states of the heart, knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He actually says that these are knowledges that an individual has to actually go and attain and has to acquire them in order to learn more about these different things. Then he talks about religious knowledge. So he says religious knowledge can be via an authority, or it can be directly. So via authority is like the lay Muslim, right? So this is not something that we would learn on our own. We would actually need guides to tell us on how it is that this knowledge of the heart or this religious knowledge would be required. And then you have those individuals who receive this knowledge directly. Those people can be prophets, or they can be awliya. They can be a wali. Now, what is the difference between this direct type of knowledge that these individuals are receiving? One comes by revelation, right? One comes by direct revelation via means of an angel or directly. The other one comes by inspiration. The difference, or the major difference between these two, is that one comes with stipulations and regulations, right? One comes with the sharia. So when you have a revelation, you will have rulings that are associated with that, versus inspiration, where you don't have specific rulings associated with that, right? A wali will never be inspired to say, okay, hey, it's an obligation now for you to to include a sixth prayer, or the zakat has been increased to 3%, for example. That would never happen. You will never have tashri'ah with inspiration, right? With revelation, you will have rulings that are actually revealed with that. Any questions on this chart before we continue?
Shaykh, speaking of intuitive, intellectual knowledge via intuitive, could that be fitra? Would that?
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. So the question would be, okay, where does that come from? And Ghazali doesn't really answer that. I mean, if you guys want to talk about this, I think this is a really nice discussion.
Okay. Well, that's. I see.
Right. So you have something that you have scientists actually have proposed something called genetic imprinting, communal knowledge, things that are passed down via again via genes, right? These are things that are inherited. Miguel, go ahead. You have something?
Yes. Assalamu alaikum. It was also about the intuitive side of things. And I'm very sorry I came in a bit late here, so I saw the question mark under intuitive. So I'm very much question mark at the moment.
Yeah. So the only reason I put a question mark there is because Ghazali himself doesn't answer. Now, he himself, he's like I don't know. And like I said, there are certain things that do give us indication on where this intuitive knowledge comes from, and I think a lot of that has to do with, again, genetic imprinting. I really believe that this is something that is passed down in the genetic code, and Allah knows best. How this comes about and what it is. Like Nazim mentioned, it is fitri, and that's exactly what he's talking about. It is something that is intuitive, it is something that's natural, but how is it passed down? Where does this information come from? And this is, again, this is a discussion that definitely can be had, and there are indicators to show us that these things do happen and they can be passed down genetically, but Allah knows best.
Because something may make sense that to someone else makes no sense whatsoever. Yes.
Like, give an example.
Let's say there's on data and paper, you interview someone for employment, and they seem like the best candidate, but then you interview them, and through experience and just intuition, you immediately realize through a conversation,
Right. So that's I would say that's more acquired worldly knowledge, and the reason for that is because it's a summary of a lot of your experiences and interaction. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Right. So you've learned to filter that. I think something more intuitive would be like, for example, a child learning to latch on to his mother's breast. Like that's who taught that child to do that. Does that make sense?
Okay, that makes complete sense.
You know what I mean? Or the fact that a child is comforted immediately by his mother, right? Versus other beings, and sometimes just the recognition and that smell. Where did that knowledge come from? Allahu alam, right? Like we don't know. In terms of what you're talking about, that's more intuition. Intuition is usually based on personal experiences or previous experiences that give them an idea because of the number of interactions that they've had. There are some people who are just more perceptive than others, and they're able to pick up on certain social cues in order for them to kind of give them an idea like, yeah, you know what, this person might not be a good hire for me.
I think that's a kind of interesting point though that this brother Miguel made, because I think maybe intuitive knowledge is like baseline, like basically it's like what you don't get credit for, right? Like, like, and everyone's baseline is different, and so like some people have more intuitive knowledge than others, because Allah just bless them with a higher baseline. But at the end of the day, it's like the line in the sand that says, okay, well, you don't get any credit for this. Like, it's really what's beyond this is when you start to split into the worldly versus the worldly. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a natural gift of a base. I don't know. That's how I was thinking of it.
Yeah, no. So I think you and Miguel are saying the same thing, and I think that's different than what Ghazāli is actually pointing to here. Okay. What you guys are talking about is just natural ability, right? So there are individuals who do have a natural ability because of they're really perceptive. They pick up on social cues. They're able to, because of previous interactions, kind of determine, like, they'll develop algorithms mentally where they're able to kind of box people into certain things, be like, okay, usually people with XYZ traits will end up in this, and that's why this person won't be, good for me. And there's some people who are just intuitive in other ways, where they'll sit in a room and they'll look around and they'll be like, all right, this situation is going to go south, and they'll get up and they'll excuse themselves. And you find out later that, there's a big fight that broke out into the room. A lot of it has to do with it. This is something that's called, but it's called it's like fatana. And it's like this ability, like Imam Shafi, he was very much obsessed with this in initially, where he wanted this idea, or he wanted this ability to have this perception and to have this insight. And he's like, I wasted so much time trying to develop this skill and to develop this ability, only to realize that it's just natural within some people, and it's not natural in others.
Yeah. That's funny.
So over here, there are a few things that I noted. Number one, that Ghazāli claims that this happens at the age of rushd, and with a mystical pen. And this mystical pen is basically, the mystical pen is when your deeds actually start becoming recorded. So he's saying that this ability, to have all this, to be able to acquire religious or intellectual knowledge, this happens at the age of rushd. And in this age of rushd, discernment, and this is why you're actually held accountable at that point. He also mentions that perception happens with the eyes and the heart. And he talks about this being similar to the horse and the rider, wearing blinders, in talking about how the rider has more control, and he's actually able to, go about and able to control the horse, even though the horse is more powerful than him and the horse is faster than him, but he has more control over it. So the heart has that similar control over the eyes, even though the heart can actually put blinders on the eyes. And I found that a very powerful metaphor, that you have this ability to actually control your senses to the point where there are certain things where you can actually control what you want to see and what you don't want to see. And then he talks about the relationship between instruction and intellect. And this is something, again, that is extremely important, that in order to develop that intellect, you need to increase in instruction and increase in guidance. So he also talks about the relationship between religion and science, and I think this is something that's important. So he talks about intellectual knowledge being similar to food, and he's like, just like you can't live without food, you cannot live without this knowledge, which brings the question, like, okay, well, what about religious knowledge? He said religious knowledge is like medicine. Right. And again, the metaphors that Ghazāli brings are really beautiful. They're really nice. And I find them, really apt to the points that he tries to bring, and the points that he tries to make. So, intellectual food is something that you need daily. Right. But religious knowledge and medicine is not something that you necessarily need daily. You have different types of medicine, right? So you have proactive medicines like vitamins, and other herbs and minerals that we take in order to prevent us from getting sick. So we have preventative medicine, and then we have like reactive medicine, that after we get sick, these are things that we take. So I really thought that both of these are used to maintain your health, obviously, but to maintain your health in different ways. And another point that he brings out, and this is something that he mentions earlier in the book as well, that these things can never contradict, right? So the medicine should never harm the food, and the food should never harm the medicine. They should always be in this like symbiosis, and they should always be in this balance that is supposed to bring out the best in an individual and keep him in his top physical, mental, spiritual shape. So he also talks about having mastery of these two things, like having mastery of these two sciences. So he says if an individual has mastery of the intellectual sciences and the mastery of the religious sciences, he questions that, and he says, is this actually possible? Is it possible to have mastery of these intellectual sciences and have mastery of these religious sciences, or not? So he mentions here, and this is something that's really, really interesting, the way that he speaks about it. He says, فالجمع بين الكمال والاستبصار في مصالح الدنيا والدين لا يكاد يتيسر إلا لمن رسخه الله لتدبير عباده في معاشهم ومعادهم وهم الأنبياء المؤيدون بروح القدس المستمدون من القوة الإلهية التي تتسع لجميع الأمور ولا تضيق عنها. فأما قلوب سائر الخلق فإنها إذا اشتغلت بأمر انصرفت عن الآخر وقصرت عن الاستكمال فيه. So over here he says that it's basically it's not possible for an individual to bring about the benefits in both of these worldly and otherworldly sciences, right? Of these religious and the intellectual sciences. And he said this is only possible for those individuals who have this balance in their worship. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has actually embedded that in these particular individuals. He said, and these individuals are only the anbiya. And the reason that it only comes from the anbiya, and the reason that it only comes in over here, he doesn't even mention the awliya. He says the anbiya specifically. He said in the prophets specifically. Why? Because they're aided by Ruh al-Qudus, because they're aided with Jibreel alayhi salatu wassalam, and they're aided with this divine power. They're divided with this divine power, and that's why it's the world does not tighten or grasp around them. But he says, فَأَمَّا قُلُوبُ سَائِرِ الْخَلْقِ, as for all the rest of creation, then if they busy themselves with one, then they will turn away from another. And if they busy themselves with the other, they'll turn away from the first. It's not possible that they're able to actually balance those things. So what do you guys think about this? What do you think about this statement that Ghazāli brings here?
It's terrible, man.
It's terrible?
I don't know if it's by design, in the sense that this is the suffering of being human. We're constantly going back and forth, or it's like, hey, this is just a choice you have, and you go either one way or the other. Because it's a little disheartening to say, like, you can't have both. Mm-hmm. But it's, I guess that's just a reality. But
so what is it that he's saying exactly, though? Is he saying here now that the anbiya, the prophets, they had balance, or they were masters of both intellectual and religious sciences?
They had the capacity, apparently, that one progression in one wouldn't negate from the other.
Okay. Anyone else? You guys can raise your hands.
I think one of the comments that he's making, right?
You're I don't know if it's a problem with your internet or the mic.
Is that better? No.
Try again.
Hello?
No, it's
Hello?
really broken. Oh, it's better now. Go ahead.
Okay. I think he's making a commentary on mastery, right? That people can study both, but not necessarily have mastery of them unless from the ranks of the Anbiya.
Okay, so you're understanding that the Anbiya, the prophets, had mastery of both the intellectual and the religious sciences?
They're the only ones capable of having that mastery, but we as general people are not capable of having that mastery.
Okay. I took away something a little different, but that's really interesting. Anyone else? So the way I actually read it was that I feel, and Allah knows best, that there is an implication here that they do have the ability to have mastery of both. But the reality is that you don't find any prophet that has complete mastery of the worldly, of the intellectual sciences, right? And even within religious mastery itself, you have ranks, right? So our messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was the master of masters, right? He was the master of masters. So obviously within that, there are levels too. What I think Ghazāli is actually talking about is that they mastered the balance between these two things, right? So they balanced between these two sciences. They balanced between the intellectual sciences and the religious sciences, not necessarily mastery over them individually. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Right. So only they can have that balance. We are unable to balance. Like we will always sway one way or we're going to sway the other. And this is why the mastery of balance versus the mastery of the individual sciences is not what Ghazāli is talking about here. He's talking about actually balancing those two things. And he says that the rest of creation, they're not able to do that, right? They just don't have that ability. Allah hasn't given them that ability.
So are we sinning? Are we entering sin if we're the scale tips in our lives towards worldly knowledge?
So I think that's a good discussion point. Nazim, go ahead.
Just to the point of mastery by prophets, I just recalled when our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he seemed to advise his companions to do something with trees, to date trees or something, and he just suggested, but the companions took it like a command, like a serious advice, and then when the trees didn't grow and didn't work out, they came to him saying, "Ya Rasulullah, as you said, it didn't work out," and he said, "I just suggested, I didn't advise you, and you know this world better than I do."
Yes.
I mean, would that be as a
yeah, that's a perfect example. So basically, this hadith in Sahih Muslim, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he saw them cross-pollinating the trees, and he said to them, he said, "I don't see any benefit in this." So what happened is that they didn't cross-pollinate this year, and they went to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they said, "Well, you told us that there's no benefit in this, and now our trees aren't producing as many fruits. Like we're not getting as many dates as we normally do." So the Prophet ﷺ responded saying, "Antum a'lamu bi umuri dunyakum," that you guys know more in your worldly affairs than I do. So actual practical mastery of these intellectual sciences is not why the Anbiya were sent, right? They were sent because they had a level of religious mastery, and even those were levels, right? We understand that the religious mastery, the highest level, was that of our beloved Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the important thing to note here, and like I said, I believe that it's the balance that Ghazāli is talking about. So what do you guys think about leaning one way or another? Is that a problem? Is that an issue?
No, I think
Depending on the context, a certain prophet dealing with his nation would need maybe more focus in one area than another.
Right. Okay. That's fair. Nazim.
You did not necessarily mean prophets, right? You didn't mean all general everybody.
I'm sorry, concerning. Yeah. No, I'm not talking about the prophet, because the prophets, we said they had mastery of balance, right? That's something that's very clear.
In my reading, Ghazāli meant that people should strive to do good, to do well in both. But if one masters one at the cost of the other is no good. It's kind of skewed information, skewed knowledge.
Okay.
in my review.
Hey, no problem. Uthman.
Yes, I think what Al-Ghazali is saying is that for you to actually attain complete mastery, like mastery in a capital, in a small m, you really need to focus and zoom into that one specific thing. Because if you say, I will do a lot of things, you'll have iltifat and you will not accomplish any of it.
Yes.
Right? Even in our daily life, when you do a PhD, you do a PhD in certain concentration.
Yes.
Not in every discipline. So I think that is what he's trying to say in our case to benefit most out of.
And I mean, and not just that, even in our practical life, we have a number of even within a religious sense, how many, religious scholars or theologians do we have? And how many Sufi masters do we have? And how often do they cross over? It's not very common, right? You will usually, scholars will not become Sufi masters, and usually Sufi masters themselves will not be scholars. It's not very common that you will find them mastering both intellectual and religious. It's very difficult because as an individual, we have limited time, we have limited ability, and because we are not from the Anbiya, we're just not. Having that balance between those two is not something that's attainable, and I don't think that's a problem. I don't think that's an issue. You can be was the you guys, I'm sure you guys know the English phrase, right? Jack of all trades, master of none.
Yes.
What does that mean?
You know a little bit of everything, but you're not a master of anything.
Right, so you don't have a depth of knowledge of any subject in particular, but you know a little bit of everything, and that's what's but you didn't master it, right? Which is exactly what is being discussed here and what is being talked about here. Uthman, hold on.
The Sufis have a qaida in their suluk that says al-multafit la yasil. Right, the person who gazes, who always
who
looks
turns
right
away,
and left.
yeah, he'll never reach his goal. No, jazakallah khair. And it's wallahi, it's very natural. It's something that we find, and like I said, he's there's no blame here. He's saying that this is something that is very natural. It's something that you will find with every single individual and every single person. And there's no one that is there that's meant to be faulted in these particular situations.
But it sounds very negative, right? Because it sounds like, hey, it sounds like, even when you said about the Anbiya that the world could not grasp them. It's almost like a snake that's like wrapping around you, right? And it's like choking you, and it sounds like it's, the dunya versus the hereafter, and so.
So I think that's where there's I think there might be a slight disconnect there. So let's go back to this chart. You see this chart?
Yeah.
Yes.
So over here, intellectual sciences include religious knowledge. It doesn't exclude them. Do you see that? These are just types of knowledge. It's not, when I talk about intellectual sciences, I don't mean specifically worldly sciences. I mean spiritual sciences too. Do you see that or no?
So because so are you saying that under intellectual, under acquired, under worldly, you have things like medicine, and so
Yes.
there's still good, there's good in this stuff, right?
Yeah,
or
absolutely.
even in science, math or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not that it's just that there's always going to be a pull and push between these two.
No, absolutely. Because the thing, he even mentions that there's levels, right? There's levels of people. There's the lay Muslim, then there's the scholar, and then there's the arif. Is there anything wrong with a person going through their life as a lay Muslim?
Not necessarily, no.
No, there's no fault. There's no fault to him. If he does not strive to become better than that, is there an issue? Did the Prophet ﷺ command every single person to be a scholar? Or did he command every single person, to be a Sufi? Did he command every single person to be an arif? Did he command every single person to be an engineer or a cleaner? What did he command us? What did he command us to do essentially?
Seek knowledge.
Well, seek knowledge. What does that mean? I would even challenge that. Are you talking about the hadith? طلب العلم فريضة على كل مسلم.
Yes.
The hadith is weak.
Weak.
There's a good effort though. I like that.
And is this Sheikh the ziyada is it موضوع too? Muslimah?
Yeah. That's لا أصل له.
Okay, that's right.
Because the Muslim is encompassing enough, but that hadith is weak. Yani the first person that even authenticated was Suyuti, and he died 9/11. So you but Miguel, what'd you say? Worship Allah. Wallahi, that's all we're commanded to do. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, all he wants from us is to worship him. That's it. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he came and he taught us, all he wants us is to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like even seeking knowledge, to what extent? Most people have enough knowledge to practice their day-to-day religion, very honestly. The one additional thing I would qualify and I would add to that is knowing a person of knowledge. And it doesn't have to even be a scholar. We all just need to be connected to someone who can guide us when we need more information or when we need guidance. That's it. But it's a very simple request that Allah has from us. وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسِ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that I have not created the jinn and mankind except to worship me. He says, I don't need anything from you. I don't need anything from you. I don't need rizq. I don't need anything. I just want you to worship me. That's it. How much you worship me? Well, this is our decision. This is where we decide. Why are there levels to paradise? Because there are people who decide, I want to take those extra steps and I want to work harder. I want to reach higher. But Allah doesn't obligate all of us to seek firdaus, to seek the highest level. He obligates us to worship him. That's it. Is it enough for a person to go through his life just being a good person, having good khuluq, fulfilling his 5 arkan al-Islam, and he's okay? Yeah, that's it. Well, he's fulfilled what Allah has asked from him. He hasn't fallen short in any way. Say it. Does that help? Anybody want to add to that comment? So I'll share a quick anecdote. I had a consultation today with a sister, and she had a few questions, and she said, "Wallahi, Sheikh, you have made things so easy for me." And I was so happy because that is the goal of the deen, right? To facilitate, and we should be making things easy. The only people who are making things difficult are our Muslim brothers and sisters. Islam has not made anything difficult. It is only the Muslims that make things difficult, and we make things difficult on one another, unfortunately. It's very, very frustrating. It's very sad. But there's nothing difficult about this deen. And like I said, what does Allah want from us? That's it. He just wants the 5 pillars. That's it. Believe in him, believe in his messenger, pray, give zakat, fast, and hajj. And even in some of these, Allah has given concessions, right? If you reach old age and it affects your health, if you haven't reached the nisab, the minimum amount, you don't have to pay zakat. If you can't afford it, you don't have to make hajj. Like, it's just amazing how very basic this religion is. Allah doesn't want us to lie. He doesn't want us to backbite. He doesn't want us to steal. He doesn't want us to murder, right? It's very, very simple requests that Allah has from us. And if a person goes through life just doing these things, just think about these. I really just think about that. Just like the Bedouin man who came to the Prophet ﷺ, asked him, what does Allah want from me? What does Allah expect from me? He says, to believe in him and to worship him, to believe in my messengership, to pray, to fast, to da. And the man asked, he said, okay, well, other than these 5 prayers, do I have to do more than that? The Prophet ﷺ said no. He said, other than this month of Ramadan, do I need to fast more than that? He said no.
Well, what do you think about the fact that there needs to be balance, or there's an expectation of balance, and so for the Bedouin man, that's enough. But as as individuals we progress on the worldly side, that there's an expectation that we progress the other side as equally as possible, and if we're not, we're being consumed by the other side.
All right,
Therefore, it's not enough to do.
That's a very good point. What is too much? At what point does my worldly, or am I seeking this worldly, the good in this world? At what point does it become a problem, or does it become an issue? It's a question.
Or
What-
even that,
Uh-huh.
or even the progression within the worldly side. It's not that the imbalance is really the issue.
But what does balance mean, Akhi? If
It means to detract from the worldly side and then kind of balance the equation, right? And then to give.
But I'm saying, what is, number one, how do I balance the equation, and what does that mean, and what does detracting mean?
By reducing the worldly side and then giving, taking hours and time or money away from one side.
Okay, so let's say that I'm increasing in my work every week, and I'm getting more and more money. But I asked this person, I said, hey, do you pray? Yeah, alhamdulillah, I always pray on time. Are you giving your zakat? Yes, I give my zakat every year. Have you made hajj? Yeah, I made hajj, and inshallah I hope I can make hajj again in the future. It's like, when Ramadan comes around, what do you do? Oh, I fast. What more do you want from this person, Fine? Well, I have my own Learjet too, and I have a Lamborghini, and I own 3 houses, one in the Caribbean, and one in Spain, and one in Los Angeles. What has he done wrong? Ahsant. Who's Nazim? And that, you're absolutely right. Did you read that, Fike?
That leads to violating the rights of Allah and the rights of others. Yeah.
That's it. This is where disbalance comes in. I'm allowed to continue seeking my self-interests. I'm allowed to continue getting richer. I'm allowed to continue buying more things up until 2 points. The moment I take from somebody else's rights, the moment I have oppressed someone else, I have violated now, and I have brought disbalance. The moment I take from Allah's rights, I have brought disbalance. That is where balance is. If because of me seeking money, I've stopped praying, then I've brought disbalance. If because of me working so many hours, I'm not giving my family time, I have brought disbalance. And look at both of these situations. One I took from Allah's rights, and one I took from the rights of others. Does that make sense? Does that help?
Yeah. So naturally, the balancing act becomes more difficult, and so. Okay. All right.
I mean, life's not easy, man. Sorry. Zishan, go ahead.
I think it sounds very simple, but it's really it's difficult, right? Because I mean, you have the whole element of shaitan being there, right? And then you have other hadiths, right? You read some hadiths and they're very, to the point where you just have to do all the things you mentioned, and that's it, right? But then there's other things which scare the hell out of you, right? For example, if you have mustard seed of pride in your heart, you can no person will enter paradise if you have mustard seed worth of pride. Now I look at myself, and you mentioned Lamborghinis, Mercedes. Yeah. If I have one of these cars, I'm very likely to look down at somebody, right? And then I might get pride.
Well,
right? And then one more. Sorry, I'll mention one more, right? So the other one is also that your level of belief. I mean, you're never gonna get to the point where you want to unless you give most what you love for yourself, right? You give that from that.
Okay.
I think these are the things that kind of complicate, right?
No. So the thing is, when it talks about having nice things, there's a companion who came to the Prophet ﷺ complaining about a similar issue, and the Prophet ﷺ responded. He said that Allah is beautiful and loves beautiful things, and he said he loves that a slave shows his blessings upon him. And if Allah has blessed me with wealth, then I should show that I have it. I shouldn't live like a pauper. In a macro sense, me looking like a pauper and me looking like a poor man, even though I'm extremely wealthy, how attractive is that to the non-Muslim who wants to come to Islam?
turn off for them.
It is a big turnoff. It'd be like, man, I have all these nice things. I have to give it up if I become Muslim. And it's very unnatural. It's very unnatural to prevent people from seeking their self-interests. It's a very Islamic concept to seek those things. And as for pride is that's a personal test. And the moment that I have pride, and what does pride mean? Pride means looking down on others. The moment I have that in my heart, what do you think I should do? What practices should I start, Zishan?
There's a lot.
No, there are a lot, but some of them, those things, I might have to get rid of those things.
Yeah,
right.
Right.
I might have to get rid of those things because I'm like, you know what? Allah tested me and I'm failing this test. I need to change.
It's like a self issue.
Right, but it's a self. Yeah, this is not like here superficially. I've done nothing wrong. Internally, I've recognized that, and I need to take steps to rectify that and to do something about that. And what was the second thing you mentioned? You mentioned pride, and what was the second one?
And that was it. The pride and give from what you love the most, right? So, and the third one is love the Prophet. You have to love the Prophet ﷺ more than you love yourself, right? So, I mean, how many of us, like, I look at myself and I ask that question every day to myself. I'm like, do I love the Prophet ﷺ more than I love myself?
Yeah.
Right? And then I want to say yes, but then when I think about all the things that I'm doing, there's no way I can just say, yeah, absolutely. You know, I love the Prophet more, because if I did, there'll be tons of other things that I would be doing that I'm not doing.
Well, what does it mean to love him? I think that's a valid question.
You follow his commands, right? You follow everything, and you look at him as an example. So you live your daily life with him as an example, and then we see ourselves here, right? And that's what I meant. I wish it was that simple. Like things get more complicated, right? So it was that simple for me when I was young. I wasn't married, right? I was more in a mental state where these things kind of were easier for me than it is now. Now that I think about it, I have a house. I have to make these payments, right? Would the Prophet ﷺ would take out a loan and do all of this, right? And at some points you're like, well, I still have to live in this life, and I still have to raise my kids. But
the better question wouldn't be would he do it? The better question would be would he allow me to? I don't know if you're familiar with the hadith of Abu Bakr. He came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said to him, he's like halakt ya Rasulullah. He's like, I'm destroyed. The Prophet ﷺ he said, what happened? He said, when I'm with you, I'm constantly remembering Allah. And my Iman feels like it's bursting through my chest. He said, but then I go home and I get busy with my wife and my kids and I forget about all those things. Like I'm not the way I was like I was with you. And I feel like a hypocrite. The Prophet ﷺ, he smiled and he said to him, he said, Ya Abu Bakr, he said, had you been the way you were with your family, went like you are with me, he said, the angels would descend from the sky and they would walk the street holding your hand.
Right. Yeah.
Right. He's like, listen, it's natural. It's okay. You have a time for this and you have a time for that. It's not a big deal. We have to make sure that, and I know I might sound like I'm oversimplifying it, but the reality is, wallahi, it is simple. The biggest challenge is our internal one. That being mindful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and turning back to him and making sure that he is an active part of our decision making in everything that we do. And even loving the Prophet ﷺ, like I said, sometimes we think, man, would the Prophet ﷺ do that? No, but the Prophet ﷺ was also held to a higher standard. He ﷺ, he never lied, ever. There's never a point where he ﷺ lied, even to save himself. But he allowed his companions to do it. He never borrowed money from any of his companions, even the most wealthiest ones who probably would have just given him the money. But he allowed other companions to borrow from each other. So there are certain things that he as an individual had a standard that he had to maintain. I mean, he was the Prophet of Allah. He was the final messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And in love, the reality is it is a feeling that we have in our hearts for him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there are certain things like, yeah, he might not have done that, but there are certain things that he did for preference purposes too. He dressed a certain way. He ate certain food. And while we might try to imitate him and try to eat those things and try to dress in that way, and that is a sign of our love, he never obligated those things for us. So I think it's important to kind of keep some of those things in perspective. And I really believe the problem I also have is like, a lot of our mashayikh and a lot of our scholars, they really have like this masochist mentality that like, oh, you're just in a state of sin and you're always sinning and you're just a bad person. And no, man, it's not like that. That's not how Islam is supposed to be. Islam is supposed to be liberating. The Prophet ﷺ, it's a beautiful hadith. He says, يَدْخُلُ الْجَنَّةَ أَقْوَامًا أَفْئِدَتُهُمْ كَأَفْئِدَةِ الطُّيُورِ. He said that there will be a group of people who enter paradise. Their hearts will be light as the hearts of birds. This person is just positive, has no negative outlook toward anything. Anytime someone says something to him, he takes it with a grain of salt. He lives his life happily. He's not living with this constant dread of like, sin and like just depressed. And but like having those moments is healthy. I think that's fine, where we should really look back on our day and be upset on how we spent that day. But constantly living in that depressed state, that is not healthy. It really isn't. Having those moments, I think, is normal. But being like that consistently, this is completely antithetical to Islam. Is there a similarity between intuitive and inspiration? No, these are two different things. Intuitive is just natural knowledge that we have. Inspiration is something that gives us religious insight. So intuitive things will be worldly insight, and the religious things will be that'll be through inspiration. Who has their hands raised? Zishan and then Jawad.
No, sorry, I think that was from before.
Okay. Jawad, go ahead.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Good question. What about that hadith that just says a believer knows the burden of the sin more or less, and then he feels that burden, and then he always feel that he has so much load to carry because he has all the sins, and he thinks of his sin as really big, versus a I don't know. I think I forgot who else was referring. It was a Munafiq. He thinks of his sins as nothing, and then
no, absolutely. But the thing is, even that with that mentality and mindset, that should be that's a preventative mindset. That these sins are so major, they're so big, I don't want to be anywhere near them. Versus I'm carrying all of these sins all the time, and I'm constantly burdened. Because a person who is in a constant state, again, there's a difference between having that mindset time and time again versus somebody who's constantly carrying those sins. Eventually what happens is the burden of those sins crush us, they crush our spirit, and they crush our hope. Versus remembering those sins and remembering those opportunities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us to repent from them, and realizing how big these sins are. Again, these are all preventative measures, and that the Prophet ﷺ gave us. If we view these sins to be like mountains, it'll be much easier for us to stay away from them, versus us carrying mountains of sins. Are we all sinners? Yeah, absolutely. We all sin. And we really should ponder over that. And this is one of the purposes and one of the reasons we pray and we make tawbah and we make istighfar. But carrying that constant burden over our shoulders, wallahi, it's crushing. Wallahi, it's crushing. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I understood. Actually, I understand better now.
I mean,
sorry.
No problem. Nazim, go ahead.
Speaking of your to this point, I remember I think it's not a hadith, but scholars point that I believe it's Iman is like a bird of two wings, one of optimism that inshallah I'll get to the Jannah, and the other wing is fear, or what if so, meaning scholars point that you should have both in a healthy, balanced way.
No, there's a balance between hope and fear, right? So they say Iman is like a bird. It's a bird that has two wings. One wing is fear and the other wing is hope. And the moment you lose balance in that, you'll lose your flight, and your Iman will lose its way. So you have to have that balance. Wallahi, you have to have that balance. It's just, I really feel like there's just so many people on the minbar today and just constantly bombarding people with like, you're sinners and there's nothing you can do. And like, it's because of our sins. And it's not how it was. I can't imagine the Prophet ﷺ ever getting up on the minbar and just constantly berating people about how bad they are. It just seems so anti-prophetic. He he's someone who inspired them. Like, were there situations where he warned them and he was, yeah, absolutely, and that's important. But just to constantly be in that negative state, I think it's extremely unhealthy. I don't think it's Islamic at all. But we have time for one more question, inshallah, and then next week we will start with chapter 8. So if we have no more questions, wallahu a'lam wa sallallahu ala khayri khalqin nabiyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Ameen wa iyyak ya akhi. Ameen wa iyyak. Subhanaka wa bihamdika wa ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.